Many people today are looking for an inexpensive, convenient, and effective pulmonary physical training system that will help them breathe better. This system came to the United States from Germany in the early 1940s. I learned it around 10 years later when I was a boy in around 1954. It didn't have a name then, but today I call it HARP-optimized pulmonary education. HOPE. For this lesson, I'll be using a smart roller, which is a high-quality foam roller. I'll place a 4K kettlebell in the center of my epigastric triangle with the handle pointing downward, and I'll use a light guide ball to keep the chest expanded, the elbows high, and the wrist in neutral. I'll also be using a diatonic harmonica in key of C. I'm using a Hohner Special 20. The American Lung Association reports that by around the age of 20 to 25, our lungs are about as mature as they're ever going to be. And after around the age of 35, that function begins to decline slowly as we age. And Harmonica Therapy pioneer Dr. John Shaman reports that between the ages of 30 and 70, we're going to lose half of our lung function. That means we're going to be half dead. And for children suffering with pulmonary problems early in their life, it can be a very rocky road. Now let's put aside pollution and some of the external factors and look simply at what happens to our bodies as we age. Let's quickly go down the list. The diaphragm's going to weaken. That'll make it more difficult for us to inhale and exhale. The rib cage bones are going to thin and grow deformed, and that's going to impair chest expansion and contraction. Then the muscles and tissue that keep the airways open are going to lose their elasticity. The alveoli are going to lose their shape and become impaired. Brain function that controls breathing may not even send strong or clear neural signals to the lungs. And then the nerves and airways that trigger coughing will become less sensitive to foreign particles. And when those poison particles build up in the lungs, they can cause severe tissue damage. Now, all of these changes can cause the air to get trapped and decrease the amount of oxygen moving in and the carbon monoxide moving out of the bloodstream. And that brings us to harmonica therapy. Hospitals and clinics around the country are using harmonicas to treat COPD, PTSD, and other related maladies. But when we look carefully at the body mechanics, you can see they're insufficient. There are workshops and training for COPD, but there are also an increasing number of harmonica workshops for the general public. Here's one at a YMCA called Harmonicas for Health. No mention of harmonica therapy, simply harmonicas to breathe better. Here's another one, a 6-week course. Now, some clinics are even advertising on their harmonicas. And you can find t-shirts and mugs. And there are a growing number of therapists like Stephanie Williams from the COPD Foundation that agree harmonicas are great tools for your COPD toolbox. There are even some ingenious harmonicas designed especially for pulmonary health. And these things vibrate all the way to your soul. Now, these are some of the potential harmonica benefits that I found online, so let's not accept them as fact, simply look at what's happening out there in the world around us. One of the more interesting is the fourth one, which connects harmonica practice to yogic Bhastrika and Kapalabhati. That's pranayama, as many of you know. But what does the science tell us? Well, in 2012, these researchers published an article in the Rehabilitation Nursing, and they found no effect. And then at Baylor in 2020, these folks found that after 12 weeks, significant improvement. So it probably has something to do with the methods, the materials, and the motivators. And that's where this story begins. It was around 1954, and I think I was around 9 years old. I lived in a town called Davenport, Iowa. I was born there, grew up. It's a rough river town right on the Mississippi River. And that block was just a few blocks from my home, so you could get an idea of the gritty urban post-war feel to it all. In the 1850s, the government built a bridge across the river from Rock Island on the east side of the Mississippi to Davenport on the west, and that opened the doorway for immigrants coming into the country. Davenport was settled mostly by Germans, and so the Horner harp was very popular back then. But for most of us kids, it would have been something like Roy Rogers with solid brass plates, by the way, and that's no joke. That means it was a pretty good harp. And there were lots of different kinds back then. Now, across the river in Rock Island, the Rock Island Lines grew up, and this served 14 states all over the West. And then it also went to Chicago. That means that people from all over the world were flowing through Davenport. Lots of ideas, lots of travelers. And when I was really young, I remember the locomotives. This was probably 1950 or so. And there were still a lot of them around. But by the time I was maybe in junior high school or early high school, we had these beautiful rockets. What a transition. My old man was a union organizer, vice president of the union back then. And as many of you know, there was a lot of violence and struggle for equal wages and worker rights. We had this old record player with a crank on it, something like this one. And he had these albums, these 78 RPM albums, and there were cowboy songs with harmonicas on them. And then there was Woody Guthrie. He had these Woody Guthrie songs. And if you've never heard Woody Guthrie, I'll tell you what, you want to learn about the United States, just go on YouTube and just settle in for a couple hours and listen to his poetry. He traveled the rails. He saw America. He wrote, "This land is your land. This land is my land." Just an amazing guy. And being a little boy at the time, I didn't know a lot of these words. So Woody Guthrie gave me a vocabulary. I even learned about fascists back then. Now in the summer, since we had rail lines everywhere along the river, it was a perfect stopping place for the Royal American shows. And if you never heard of it, to say it was large is an understatement. It was just huge, and it needed a lot of temp workers to set up. So in those days, a lot of homeless hobos, right after the war, they call them hobos, they were traveling on the rails because the trains were so big back then, and we didn't have interstates yet. We were just building that up. And they'd come into town in the summer. They'd camp along the river. And they'd build little shanties like this one. I don't know where this one was. It's not Davenport, but it was something like that. They'd build their shelters along the river in the summer. Red Skelton and others had fun with them and called them things like Freddie the Freeloader. But the truth is, and I know because I lived right around the corner from Skid Row where a lot of the hobos would come. Yeah, there were a lot of evil guys, but boy, there were some war heroes and this is Ernest Hemingway. He rode the rails in the 1920s. Whole families would ride the rails. There was so much poverty right after the war. There were some really good men back there and women that traveled the rails. And I met one of them living down along the river one day. And he showed me his method of playing the harp. It was unlike any method I'd ever seen. It was quite a gift. Now, up until World War II, there were harmonica orchestras all over the United States. And school after school, you can see kids playing harmonicas and performing in their costumes. School after school. This went on from 1920 all the way up to the beginning of World War II. Imagine the impact it had on their pulmonary health. Here's a harmonica band. You see, these kids would grow up then from the 20s, and now they're young people, and they're playing in these harmonica bands. And this one's performing for President Hoover at the White House with one of the newest members of the harmonica community. But look carefully. You see his wrist? It's bent. These are important little things to see. Look at the mechanics. The party car. One of my favorite photos in my entire harmonica collection. a stress reliever high off the ground. This is an instrument that transcends all cultures because we all breathe. Everywhere you look, you can find a harmonica years ago. And then the war came, and we couldn't get them. Very difficult to get them. Now, after the war, we began to hear the harmonica more again. Johnny Cash played one. This is Arlo Guthrie. This is Woody Guthrie's son. Of course, Bob Dylan, Neil Young, John Lennon, and the countless number of the blues harpists. And then, in the 60s, a lot of us carried our harps off to war. And once in a while, you'd see a couple guys practicing together. And now a lot of those old soldiers are using harmonicas today for therapy, like these two old vets. Now, over in Singapore right now, we have harmonica bands again. So interesting. And there's a company in Australia that uses harmonicas for team building. And that brings me to our practice and the specific differences in this system that this wonderful man taught me many years ago. I'm not sitting, I'm not standing, I'm supine. I'm lying down, face up. And that kettlebell is sitting right in the center of my epigastric triangle. Now, I didn't know all this back then, but the year I was born, 1945, Ralph Harper wrote a book called G-Suiting the Body. And he calls this place the Governor, and it's located at the center of the epigastric triangle. One presses their fingers against the center during phonation, which means making sounds. He can feel a bulge like a tense little drum head. And he called it G-suiting because it was that same type of pressure that our pilots back then were starting to use for flying. And he said, if its tension is established immediately before a phrase is said or sung, the bulge indicates an even balance between a downward balance of the diaphragm, which serves to sustain the breath, and an upward act of the lungs to expel it. A renewal of the tension occurs before each phase. When the solar plexus wobbles in the middle of a phrase with a change of pitch or an increased volume of sound, the result is a mumbling or a strained voice. In other words, this center of our voice and our breath can be developed so that we can learn to speak well and to sing, as well as breathe. It may not be possible to observe the delicate sensation of feeling at the Governor when the body is kept in a poor mechanical condition. And now we go back to that fellow sitting in the VA facility, hyperflexed. If you're doing this with inadequate body mechanics, you're not going to have the sensitivity required to feel what's going on within. So what are the causes of poor posture and body mechanics? These are just a few. Habits, muscular imbalance, pain, congenital anomalies, developmental problems, trauma. Now, these can be macro traumas or micro traumas. Just sitting every day, as our children do, at a 90-degree hip angle and on a flat desk, forces them into hyperflexed positions like this one. Now, a fellow by the name of Joel Goldwaite, MD, wrote a nice introduction for Mr. Harper's book, and that made a huge impact on me years later as I read his work. He was a pioneer in the study of body mechanics. In other words, he was one of the people who was able to look at all the bodies around him and see what it would take to make them human and fully upright. And he writes, I'm delighted with The Voice Governor. The appearance of the book is pleasing. I not only enjoyed it, but I'm as much pleased to have this record of careful study of the mechanics of the different parts of the body. And the Journal of the American Medical Association wrote, good posture and abdominal breathing under the control of the Governor are fundamental to good speech and song. The speaker, singer, and voice teacher will find this small volume interesting. So, let's go to work.